All right, this is Jonathan Albin. This is the Game Market Guru's Games Mastery series on Just-in-Time Productions. And today our subject matter is specifically the game group dynamics. This is something that's become clearly an important part of the story, if you will, and I wanted to cover it in a light that perhaps others might not have, or that perhaps we hadn't considered before. The first thing to realize is that the very concept of a games group has a very wide range of options. It can be as simple as a family that games together. Pardon me a second. It could be a gathering of indifferent game players that happen to have a place and a time to gather together. Pardon me again. Or it could be seriously interested novices that pool together because they hear a game's going to happen. It can be a team of experienced players that want something deeper than just to sit and roll dice, or it could even be a coherent cohort of veterans that have a collective agenda. But what in particular of interest to me is something that I've come to call the Ensemble Cast, and today we're going to be talking about each of these different types of categories and how a group can grow from the disparate games group types into a unified and coherent cast of adventurers that not only want to accomplish the story, but have the proper tools to work together to accomplish it. When we speak of games group, the first thing to look at is it really is a group. We're not talking about one or two players that play together. That's certainly an option, and in certain cases that may be the only kind of group that you can pull together. But generally speaking, a group of game players will be somewhere between 4 and 6 players that work together to achieve an objective. Now, whether the group is of a familiar nature or, let's see, get rid of that place here, or they gather together because they're at the same game store or whatever. Each of these different types of players will come to the game with individual objectives, and one of the biggest challenges as a game master is to determine how you're going to be able to advance your story with the group that you have gathered. Now, it also depends truly on the number of participants you have and what their individual goals are, but some of the easiest ways to advance a story start off with the boxed adventure. And while these are not as common nowadays as they used to be, the starter guide box for Dungeons and Dragons, for example, is just such a product. It's got a fundamental story arc that can bring characters from 1st to 3rd, maybe 4th level within the time frame of the story, but that is simple enough for even the beginner game master to comprehend the progress from one setting to the next within the story. Expanding beyond this, of course, you have the modern style of campaign play, which are the serial adventure pathways. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show. As I was saying, beyond the standard boxed adventure, like the starter guide for Dungeons and Dragons, there are the serialized adventure pathways, and in the case, the boxed adventure certainly is a way to start because it's limited in scope and is pretty clear to follow from point A to point B to point C within the story. Easy for the storyteller to advance along that course. In the case of the serialized adventures, arguably the Paizo Publishing Company did a really fine job in the Pathfinder and Starfinder projects of doing just this, creating a pathway of adventures that progress the players along the course. Now, some would argue whether or not it's truly a role-play environment, because so much of the mechanics in Pathfinder is based on position and number of inches and such, that defer the game away from a role-playing game where you're actually playing roles and characters to role-playing where you're rolling dice. But either which way, these are great examples of adventure path progressions. So in the case of a story advancement in a pathway book, you have a lot of different places to go, and arguably you could play them in different orders or mix it up. But generally, they're intended to be followed from point A to point B to point C, simply to make sure that the characters are of appropriate level to withstand the villains and the monsters therein. Now, beyond this, you have story advancement techniques such as the bounded sandbox, and this is usually the way most game masters start out when they begin their own homebrew or they begin their own story arc. They start with a framework of barriers, exterior boundaries to which the players must be held, and yet they allow the characters to investigate and explore within that framework. And even in my own historic game progression, certainly early on, the world of Nikos was broken down into separate segments, and you were isolated in your expansion. But the concept of a bounded sandbox allows the game master to explore progression paths and the different kinds of levers he'll need to move the characters along in the story. Now, what ends up being more convenient for most game masters is something along the line of an HLS process, and I use HLS to refer to it's certainly not a proprietary system, but the very concept of producing a story hook that draws the players into a direction, a line of discovery that pushes them to propel down that course, and a sinker, which is the plot twist or the monster encounter or whatever the payoff is for the process. The HLS process is pretty common. Unfortunately, because of its commonality, it's sometimes seen as being a bit tired. Within the Games Mastery series, we kind of follow up on the HLS process with a few new tools that will help players, and more particularly the storyteller, to bring his characters along towards the objective. One of these that is rather proprietary is the idea of a background driver. And what I mean by that is, when we create characters within the Nikos framework, we want to build a rich enough backstory, both between the players and the game master, that each character has something that the GM can pull against, that the storyteller can draw out and use to push that individual player in a direction. Some would argue that it's the hook in the nose of the player. I prefer not to think of it that way, simply because I consider the mastery of games to be able to get people to move in a direction that they would have wanted to go into anyway, but they might have had trepidation or fear about. And by having solid background drivers within their character, it's going to make it easier to move that character towards the destination. And I've mentioned this next one a couple of times before, but the open-ended prophecy is by far one of the strongest ways that a game master can advance a story. If a theme or a concept within the game is reinforced by a verbal or written or prop-driven prophecy, the players are going to key on that and, quite frankly, feast on it and digest it and then make it their own. Of course, wrapping this together, you need to have some sort of mechanism to allow your adventure to be less rigid than perhaps a directly written out module structure. So I recommend the Game Master Series BaubleTech process, which within the series you'll get a lot more in-depth information on how that works and how best to use that for scaling and measuring up your direction with what your player's capabilities are. Now, quite often when people talk about building a character in the story, they're talking about putting numbers on a page. Pardon me. And what I want to talk about in particular is that there is a serious difference between building a character and character building. In the case of building a character for a game, you certainly can use the by-the-book methods that are recommended by the publisher of your particular game mechanic. Dungeons and Dragons has 4 or 5 different methodologies, a points buy system, a standard number drop system, a dice rolling system, and so on. And so you can certainly use the ones that are in the rule systems for whichever game you're in. And so let's look at each of these a little bit in detail. A standard points buy system utilizes such things as skills, quirks, background, motif, that to build a series of points that are then used to modify or adjust either the pre-rolled dice numbers or the points buy system. And the benefit to it is you certainly get to build the character that you want to build, and in many cases, especially with new players, I highly recommend it. It allows them to play just what they want to play, at least initially. The secondary method that is what I consider to be hardcore is when you have a series of statistics that you roll the dice against whatever the minimums are. For example, in the case, again, of role-play games like Dungeons & Dragons, it's a combination of the values of 3d6. And hardcore, you would roll them in order and then play the class that the numbers would warrant. This does expand a player's role-play capability because they're playing a lot of different races, a lot of different classes than they might otherwise. But there are usually some downturns to that, such as in a 3d6 system, the individual die rolls can be rather brutal in terms of value. You can have a series of low numbers or a series of high numbers, both of which can be problematic in game play and in character generation. The third methodology is far more common, and that's to do a roll and move method, where you roll the number of dice rolls required, but then you place the numbers where you want them to be. Despite these, and perhaps in addition to these, you have other game systems that utilize other more unique character creation methods. For example, in the game Traveler, at least in older versions, I haven't seen the most recent, but in the older versions you had a backstory building method where you literally started your character as a punk out of high school and decide what he did as he was growing up. And as you move through the ages of his life, you're building knowledges and experiences so that by the time you've reached his, quote, character launch point, he's got enough backstory to choke a horse, and he's got the skills built up to be able to have coherent stats. Now, all of these are great, but one of the things that the Game Mastery series really focuses on is the very concept of community-built characters. And by that means the group of players that are going to play in the game, if they are willing to, it can be very strong when the character builds the characters as a community. In other words, the players talk about what roles they would like to play, what roles need to be filled within a group, so that you have a broader spectrum of options within the group, instead of perhaps everybody rolling up a fighter and then not having any rogues, or in the case of one of my groups recently, having 3 druids in the same adventure group. By using a community build process, you actually can end up with player characters that meet the demands of a group, or in other words, you're building an ensemble cast. Now, we'll come back to this a minute ago, but we're going to talk first about a group of gamers versus a player ensemble, and how the differences can make the difference in your game. So first of all, one of the greatest challenges of being a game master in role-playing games is to come up with the how the characters got together, the old you're sitting in a bar scene that is such a trope that it's, staggeringly boring. The ability instead to use the community of players to create in advance the ensemble process. They already understand that the characters know each other. They're going to know each other, whether they came out of the same backgrounds or were locally familiar with one another, or perhaps they are actually related. The origin stories process, where you're actually building the backstory as part of the process, will give a richness to the group and give them a coherency you don't normally see. In a group of gamers that just show up at the table, as mentioned, you could end up with origin stories that contradict one another or openly oppose one another and such, and make it a difficulty of bringing the players into the same fold. A second part of player continuity that you see, the issue is that the party consistency and balance, if you have a group of gamers randomly creating characters, can be terrifying. In other words, you may have no spellcasters, or you may have no healers, or you may have an overabundance of rogues. This lack of balance in the group can lead to problems in play, and thereby make the games less palatable than they might be. A third emphasis on the player ensembles can be the creation of character hooks, action levers, and proprietarily called push points. How do we create the tap points, the push points, to get the players to move in the direction that needs to be gone in, so that the story is progressed, and yet not make them feel they're being dragged through it by the nose. Of course, this can also be enhanced or amplified when the character development process includes the storyteller, so that he can actually build in plot drive and externalize character motives. Because, again, the biggest challenge of having a group of players show up with their characters is that famous line that we've sort of covered already, the "what's my motivation? Why am I here?" Now, an ensemble cast, a group of players that have thoughtfully put together the adventuring group, will also, by nature, overcome inter-party conflicts. This helps in the long term, because quite often a character that has an individually driven motivation and an individually driven background will find himself at loggerheads with the group because his agenda no longer meets theirs, and there's no interconnection between them. So it's important to build a story that takes that into account. So another tool of the ensemble cast is, therefore, there can be literally cast parties. What I mean by that is there can actually be game sessions that are game masterless. Now, it sounds frightening. Anybody who is a game master sometimes considers what would happen if his player group had a chance to talk to each other without the storyteller influence. And while it seems terrifying, it actually makes for a richer game story, because the players, once again, will be able to connect with each other's backstories and make sure they're following together. And of course, what this leads to ultimately, for good or ill, is the concept of a rational and coherently accepted retcon. In certain cases, you have to do a retraction or a revision of the "Hey, Jeanette, how are you doing? Glad to have you with us." You can have a situation in your story where you have to revise or adjust something. And if you had a group of individual characters who had their own special backgrounds, it might be rather difficult to explain or smooth over those changes in storyline and still keep in keeping with those backgrounds. Whereas if it's a composite or an ensemble cast that's gone together to discuss it, the value of that retcon will be clearly visible, and you won't have the conflicts that players might otherwise be involved with. So now it comes to an interesting take. If you develop a ensemble cast system to create your characters, all of a sudden writing for them becomes easier, because in pre-game surveys or pre-session player inputs, you can have a clear understanding of what the group is going to want to do, how they're going to work together. You may even have warm-up sessions and individual campaign reminders that will draw the players into the game at a deeper level. And in the process of writing and creating and even playing these warm-ups and prequels, if you will, you can build in plot themes. You can deal with the plot, actually the plots, the themes, your purpose for the characters, and the tempo at which you want to operate. By feedback with the group as a whole in this composite structure, this ensemble methodology, you're actually going to improve your communication, the capability of developing moments of compromise. And thanks, Jeanette. I do think I look quite fantastic. Anyway, the final thing is that you can develop points of concession, places where the group can see they may need to change their direction or maybe need to focus a little harder on what you intended for them to see. Ultimately, it builds up your enthusiasm and your confidence in using storytelling tools, because the players actually are there to hear what you have to say and want to be a part of the story you've created. And these are the recipe for a real games experience. There have been now in the last week mind-blowing games experiences 4 or 5 times in 2 or 3 different groups over the last couple of weeks that have just really exemplified how the Ensemble Cast, the collective group that are working together, can accomplish much in the story and can help amplify the storyteller's focus and intent. So now let's talk about how to get rid of some of the problems that are already inherent in roleplay, assuming you don't have an ensemble cast structure. In particular, we can look at drawing out the player inferences and purging even our own story implications. And what I mean by that is when we're looking at the story we've built, we can look to what the players are doing it within their own backgrounds, and then we either have to figure out whether we're going to amplify or downplay the information they've come up with. And the best thing to do is actually to build on the player performance. If an NPC has come up with a great story plot point that you hadn't yet covered, by all means let theirs be at least part of your thought process. That means that you have to be an aggressive and effective listener, and this is something in particular the Games Mastery series can help you work on, because we do have workshops where you actually deal with and put out your ideas about how to resolve situations, and you receive information and tools back that might improve those decision-making processes. We also include guidance on logic following. In other words, if you have set things in motion, learning how to logically progress from your actions and the player's interactions with that choice, you can increase the outcome and the import of their responses. So this includes an entire non-verbal cue card for characters. In other words, watch the body language of your players in session and pre-session and post-session, because there is just mountains of information to be learned about what they're feeling about the story, where they would like to be headed, how effective they're currently working, and things like this. And this means now that you can start to give them the opportunity and the power of ideation. They can actually put in their input both in direct confirmation with you as a storyteller, but more subtly in their interactions with non-player characters, and can source out, if you will, their own frustrations in favor of in-game frustrations to give everyone a chance to vent on those and wipe them out. Now, this, of course, depends on your players' current precedents and predictability. If they're wild cannons and they're tearing through the scenery and you're having a difficult time, it's far better to hold them in and have a conversation with them in game than it is to try to face the situation out of game without causing personal problems. We've had experiences in the past few weeks where I've realized that it's far, far better to try to keep the conflict in the context of the story than to let it leak out of the box, so to speak, because the individuals sometimes are so wrapped up in what's going on in game that they transfer that out of game into player versus player conflict, and of course we want to downplay and avoid that as much as we can. This leads, therefore, to the effective utilization of plot twists. Quite often when you're hearing a story being told by players about what's going on in game, you'll be mystified because you're not sure where they're gathering their information or on what clues they base their decisions. Nonetheless, listening to what they have to say and where they think it's going is far better to feed into that with your own adaptations and changes. When you do this, you give the characters a chance to take their role as part of an ensemble, because you're taking away the very reasons for them to want to stand behind their own private background and give them ways and lures and links to bring their character into combination with the others to develop the ensemble. So here are the real keys, ultimately the joys, if you will, of the effective ensemble. The first one is that you end internal party conflict in theory. I say in theory because not every game group can bridge these gaps. Sometimes the conflict predated the game or had to do with somebody's choice of dinner at a different game, or who knows. But the issue is that, generally speaking, if your group communally builds their characters, brings their concepts of what they want to put together and feed into one another, you get rid of inter-party conflict, because the players can put into place the very mechanisms necessary for them to understand one another in game, because they see themselves not as individual characters being drawn to their own particular story that happens to include other people, but instead see themselves as part of the team, and part of the objective is to maintain that team structure throughout. Ultimately, it increases clearer player communication, because if they have a backstory upon which to press, even when the story line gets confused or confounded, they can quite often reach back into their backstory and bring in the lines necessary for you to help them sew back together the conflicts. This also therefore leads to easier in-game conflict resolution, because the players can actually see, as it's happening, the very threads of conflict, and see how they can be tied back to their individual character backgrounds, since they were built communally. It does provide, therefore, in terms of profitability as a games group, a more professional in-play interaction, because players will act off of what they know about each other's characters rather than what they surmise about other players' attitudes. Warm-up sessions, basically, these are, let's say on a Wednesday, I need to go out and get something out of the car, and you say, hey, I'd like to do a couple of minutes of warm-up. I can say, sure, and then you just assign everybody a role. You don't give them stats, you don't give them character sheets. You just say, you're the rogue, you're the warrior, you're the thief, you're the bard, you're the wizard, and just say, I want to play this out. I want to see how this would work. And therefore you warm them up by showing them a little snippet of your world within the time frame allowed. This can be before a game can occur. Like, for example, if you come on early and there's 2 or 3 players, you say, hey, I want to warm up. I want to try a warm up of Scotterborough's Inn or Tubby's Tube House, whatever. You come up with what you want to warm up, and that's when you would play a warm up. It's just it's a quick little burst of what might happen to give them a taste of the flavor, to get you some feedback on how they're going to respond to the descriptions you give, what kind of questions they might develop, and this will help you develop your story before it's actually run as a campaign. I hope that helps you, Scott. One of the other greatest advantages of an effective ensemble is that you get more gameplay in per session, because there aren't the moments of conflict. There aren't the moments of, gee whiz, why are we here? Where's the door? How many feet to the entrance? Because somebody in the group knows, and thereby all of them know, and it makes it quicker and easier to move through the adventures. As far as another of the ultimate joys of an effective ensemble is you have greater player appreciation for what happened because they see their background, their player input in the story, in the fact that it affected everyone in the game. It doesn't leave them with the internal frustration that, for example, continuing to be the healing machine in a party that doesn't even know your character's name for a cleric or a paladin, or it'll give the spellcaster more of a sense that what he learned in the few books he read last week and how that works into the storyline for this week's adventure. So it cuts down on player internal frustration and improves greater player appreciation overall. I know we covered a lot of information today and in kind of a rapid fire formation, but the reality is that I'm really excited about the ensemble process, and I'm going to have a surprise for you guys next week concerning the upcoming website information for the World of Nikos. So make sure you check in with us next week to watch that. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru on Just in Time Productions Games Mastery Series. We're here every Monday at noon. I hope to see you next week. This is Jonathan Albin. I'm out.